welcome. Thank you for coming on a Friday afternoon. I'm Lionel Bovier, I'm the publisher of GRP Ringier, and we are here today to introduce you to one book that has been published recently, Ulrich Obrist, Brief History of New Music. I'm here on my right with Dieter Meier, artist, filmmaker, musician, Yello, you might know Yello, and a man of many talents. I'm happy to go eat in his restaurant, read his books, listen to his music. Come on, there's not so many people you can say that. We also brought some books that we'll be happy to show you around, and I'm sure that Dieter will be happy to sign as well for you after this short introduction. And we're going to try, I don't introduce you on Ulrich Obrist, you've seen him all over the newspapers, the radio, the TV, and the internet since, I don't know, since it exists. We're going to try to do something of twofold. I'm going to give you a little backstory of how this book came out, in a way how Ulrich is working. And he's going to prove me entirely wrong by doing a live interview with Dieter Meier here. So you're going to enter into some kind of production and laboratory and active moment that Ulrich likes so much. A Brief History of New Music is a sequel of A Brief History of Curating, somehow a bestseller and something we worked on quite a long time with Ulrich, trying to make it better as a table of content, more complete, more representative, the emergence of the curator. When we started to work on that, Hans mentioned that he had done many, many interviews with great musicians. And that was always even a first passion of him. So we started to discuss about putting something together that would bring Carl and Zeit, Stockhausen, Elliott Carter, Pierre Boulez, together with Xenakis, Zinoviev, Oliveros, Terry Riley, Tony Conrad, Yoko Ono, etc. And as always with Ulrich, that's only the volume 1, which means that we'll be very happy to count Dieter Meier on the volume 2 to come out, I don't know, in a couple of more years. The technique or the method of working of Ulrich, you might know, is that he's hyperactive, always on the lookout for ways to approach a subject in a different manner, using something he has learned in one field to interrogate the other one, and properly making oral history something real, which is to go search for someone, interview that person, etc. That makes it into a very intense web of relationships between the different people that speaks in that book. And of course, there's a lot of additional work to be done on the reference level, on the editing level, which is normal when you do that as a live interview. I think that what makes this book quite particular is this method of working, this approach. And this one has been sequenced as the birth of electroacoustic music. We discussed a long time about new music, and maybe Dieter has an opinion about that, about the title. But we came up to that because we saw that was a moment when classic music had to be opposed to something. Avant-garde music was one term, but then later on, when some artists and some musicians played with the pop notion, or the notion of being in pop music, then this avant-garde wasn't really resonating right. So we came up to this title, and that allowed us maybe a broader sense to integrating more people that had done contributions to, let's say, a constructed music. I think that's what we wanted to emphasize. I think that's the beginning of the story. Maybe, Dieter, just one question about the title of the book. What do you think of this, calling it A Brief History of New Music? Does it make any sense to you? And maybe you can be honest with me.
The title as such. Is this working?
Yes.
Really? Oh, okay. Well, the title, of course, reminds me of this book of a famous astrophysician, you know, who a brief history of time, I think it's called,
Certainly.
you know. And so it's
a rip-off, yeah.
It's I like it as a title, of course. It's a nice title, A Brief History of New Music, absolutely. Yeah.
But new music does resonate to you as something that appeared at a certain period and was based on an idea of constructing the music, of crafting
What
it?
I like about the title is that it says new music, and is not living up to these quite ridiculous categories of so-called pop music and new classical music, because I think these borders are quite ridiculous these days. You know, it's they say nothing, and so I like that here it's just called new music.
Hans, do you want to say something about how do you build, let's say, this archive of great musicians that you really went to meet as of, what was at the end of the 80s, I think?
Early 90s. I'd like to start by really thanking Lionel for the amazing, openness and this amazing dialogue which produces these multi-volume, adventures, because it really is a process. Obviously, for me, it always has a connection to curating. It has a connection to the medium of the exhibition, which is my profession. And one thing which really struck me, and the book started somehow with Xenakis. He was one of the first composers I met. The great Greek composer, the visionary Yannis Xenakis, and he collaborated with Corbusier and developed this pavilion for the expo in Brussels, and talked a lot in his interview about this idea that there should be spaces for sound, that in some kind of way, if you go to a museum, the whole history of experimental sound is not present in museums. I mean, there are art museums, of course, many. There are architecture museums, many. There are design museums, many. But there isn't really, in most cities, a museum. I mean, there are a few, but very, very rarely for the history of sound. And Xenakis always said there is this idea. He did exhibitions called Polytop. I think once upon a time it happened at the Pompidou during his lifetime. It happened a couple of times. A very polyphonic sound installation where people could experience sound in a way they would never experience it at home. They could sort of immerse themselves in this sound environment. And it was his dream that there would be a museum for that. And none of these pieces of Xenakis has been, exhibited in a very, very long time. So the book is also a kind of an exhibition. It's a questioning of why this institution doesn't exist. It's interviews with many of these composers. Stockhausen also had lots of ideas of sound exhibitions. So that was kind of the point of departure. And then we obviously go into many different other kind of aspects. And as always, when we Lionel knows my only recurrent question in all my interviews, of course, by editing it, which is the question of the unrealized project. So it was sort of inverting this question, and he asked me, is there an unrealized interview about sound? And I said, ever since my childhood, I wanted to do an interview with Dieter Meier. So Lionel made it happen.
You in volume 2.
Well, yeah, I mean, our approach, if I may start talking about this, to music was really that Boris and myself, we both were kind of natural born sound makers, rhythm makers, but we never were able to play an instrument. So we had to invent ourselves, so to speak, by finding sounds, real sounds, wherever they were. And we started to sample these sounds, tape loops, like, for example, one of our first snare drums that we constructed is very self-ironical, was a piece of newspaper on a table. We put 2 microphones, and then we would just go shh, 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 shh. And this was a tape loop, and we coordinated this loop with other loops, and created songs. But we never intended to be avant-garde artists. We wanted to create songs. I was just using all kinds of sounds that were similar to what was used in pop music. But as we couldn't play instruments, we had to construct our own instruments by finding sounds that would like sound a little similar, like a drum or like a bass or something like this. And this was actually the base of Yello. The other important thing is that we never composed anything. We were always like children on a beach that construct a little castle made of some Coca-Cola cups and maybe some little sticks around, and we never knew where we would end up. So in an analogy with painting, we might have started with the idea that suddenly, stroke, brushstroke by brushstroke, sound by sound, these things emerged, and suddenly it looked like, oh, now we're going to paint a rose. And at the end of the process, there was a donkey there, And I think this is one reason why people, especially children, always loved our music, because it is totally unpretentious. It's really like two children playing with sounds, and as they play along, these songs emerge. But like a wonder, there is no compositorical intention where we want to end up. We really play and come to accidental results.
And I mentioned, you mentioned the childhood and the idea of that actually leads us to the beginning. And before we talk more about Yello, I wanted to ask you about your very beginning. And you told me earlier today that you really grew up with jazz and Robert Walser in Switzerland. And I kind of wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about these two key influences of, your early years.
Well, jazz was not an influence as such that encouraged me to do something similar, but it was an expression of freedom for me. We shouldn't forget that in the 50s and 60s especially, all these incredible breakouts of freedom in music happened in jazz. It was just statements of being free at the time when the great Thelonious Monk, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, when cool came up and then free jazz later, this was for me like an awakening. It was really shaking me and moving me. It was, which is one of my definitions of art actually, it was touching my mind in a way that nothing else could touch my mind, like that music. It was like finding me really, and influenced me not as a musician, but liberated me as a young guy. It was the first statement of freedom.
And what about Robert Walser? Because I was obsessed as a child by Robert Walser. And then, one of the first shows I did was this museum for Robert Walser in his restaurant, Krone, where he always went. It wasn't his restaurant, but he always halted there. He stopped there on his famous walks. When he stopped writing, it's near Appenzell, it's in Geis. And we installed a little vitrine and did a homage there to Robert Walser. So I was fascinated to hear earlier today that you also had an obsession for Robert Walser. Can you tell us about that?
Well, absolutely. Robert Walser for me has this meta language, which is like in every phrase that he was writing, there is also an irony about this phrase. There is a meta language, and there is a very beautiful insecurity in there. But the insecurity and the questioning yourself as you're writing as a dialectical process, that was what impressed me a lot. And like Walser, he would his approach to writing was really to find out who he was at a certain moment. When you see his original manuscripts that he was writing, he was, I think, like a Zen master who could say of himself, not I'm writing, but it is writing with me. He was in an altered state of mind when he started the novel. He had no clue where this would go. It was just about being in conversation with language. And this is why I think one of the very world-famous writers and founder of a whole new approach to writing, Franz Kafka, always said that without Robert Walser, he wouldn't exist. Robert Walser was opening the door to Kafka. And Kafka, if you read his letters to friends, he would like sit at his table for 18 hours and writing his stories, and he forgot about time, he forgot about who he was, he forgot about being there, and he describes that when he finally got up from his chair after sitting for 16 hours, he could not walk anymore because his legs from being in this mood were kind of, what do you say, numb or something. Yeah, it would take him 2 hours to come out physically of this state of writing. And this is what interested me in Robert Walser, and again influenced me not as a writer, but as an approach to what you're doing. What you're doing and to whatever I do has a lot to do with sort of, it's like a footstep in the sort of being here on this planet, thrown onto this planet for a couple of 10,000 days. It's expression of my being at a certain time.
Now, earlier today we had the panel about the artist as a choreographer, and with different practitioners from younger generation who mostly grew up with the internet. And one of the things which was said is that it's no longer necessary to make a decision to be an artist or a choreographer. It's possible to have these parallel worlds, and that's something in the 89 plus research which Simon Castel and I are doing with a generation of artists born in 89 and younger. It's even stronger the case that basically very often now artists have these 4 or 5 different fields, and that through the internet I think gets stronger and stronger. We just could listen before to Ed Atkins, for example, who is a poet, he's a writer, he's a novelist, he's a visual artist, he's a filmmaker, he's a singer, he's a performer. And I think many artists who have this practice now follow basically something you've been doing very early on, and already in your 2 examples with jazz and with Robert Walser, we've got music, we've got literature, and there are so many more parallel realities. David Deutsch talks in The Fabric of Reality about these parallel realities, and interestingly enough, the first of those parallel realities in your work, where it all started, was actually not literature, but not music, was not art, was not architecture, but was poker. And I wanted to ask you if you can tell us a little bit about this early experience with poker. And we spoke about it before, that it had a very different kind of symbolic meaning then, that it was kind of illegal and, as Lionel said, a bit shabby at that time. Now it's got a very different meaning. Can you tell us about your life as a poker player?
Well, gambling is a total escape from the real world. And I think every gambler is a junkie of gambling. He is, in many cases, lying to himself when he says that he would like to be lucky and win a lot of money and then stop. That's all not true. Well, at least for the gamblers I know, including myself. When I was winning a lot of money, I could have lived for a year and doing whatever with that money. But a gambler wants to escape from the real world. When you're sitting at a poker table, there is no world behind this table. You're like a boxer in a boxing ring, only that the poker game takes 12, 14, 16 hours, and you gamble more or less every day, whereas a boxer is in there probably for an hour. But there are very many similarities, and the biggest similarity is in a boxing ring, you're busy surviving, and on the poker table, it's the same thing, and it's so intensive that there is no world outside the room in which you're gambling. So for me, the thing was, and why I became this, was really because I had absolutely no clue what to do with myself. I was trying this and trying that, and nothing really interested me. I had, after I finished my school, I started to study the law to become a lawyer, but it didn't really interest me. And then this gambling thing was a very, very strong escape from all the questions that a young guy has to ask himself, like, why am I here? What am I doing? The very existential questions. And gambling was the perfect escape.
And the next step was the somehow almost, it's kind of accidentally happened that all of a sudden you started with film and started to produce these early experimental 16mm films. You mentioned before the aspect of chance in those films. They were obviously part of this burgeoning kind of late 60s underground film scene that was shown in Nokke, a festival about which Jonas Mekas and Yoko Ono told us a lot in previous interviews, a legendary festival. And you called those films actually moving frescoes. You used the camera as a brush. Can you tell us about how these beginnings with film happened, and maybe tell us a little bit more about why you called them moving frescoes?
Well, somehow I found a 16mm camera in the house of an uncle who was filming wild animals in Africa. And I started to play around with this camera. And it took me about 2 hours to load it. And then I was just asking myself, what can I do with this camera? And for me, it had almost a therapeutical meaning, because you could write a little partiture for images. Of course, it was very speculative, because you never knew what exactly was coming out when you superimpose images 12 times, you run the camera backwards, you make a lot of single frames. But the most important thing for me was that I was not immediately confronted with what I was doing. You know, because you have these ideas and you film, and it's all happening in this wonderful little black box, and you then bring the movie to the lab, and it takes 2 or 3 days till it's processed, and then finally you see what you have done. And for me, this was always a wonder that I was able to do anything at all. And I was only able to do it because I was not confronted with the result immediately, because if I would have been confronted, I would have had so many doubts about my doing that I would never have finished even a 3-minute film.
It normally never happens. Huh? He's not getting interrupted, but I was just wondering if you agree that there seems to be a very a very early fluxus understanding in everything you're doing. I mean, you talk about chance. You're happy that something is. You say it's not a decision I make. It's more like I identify a form. I found a sound. Was it very important? I mean, were you aware of fluxus? Because I know you had a relationship with. I mean, like ECA was in Geneva, for instance, as a post-fluxus group. I know you had like many connections to that part, but was it a factor as well in shaping your practices?
Well, somehow I was connected with fluxus, and then I learned earlier, when there was an exhibition at the Tinguely Museum here in Basel, I never knew that I also was a situationist, you know. So suddenly I became a situationist, and always, of course, categories are open, and you're being put into one of these categories. It was actually a very funny thing, because the widow of an important situationist, she came to this exhibition furiously and said, "This man is not a situationist.
Yeah, they're very serious about
here."
that. It's true.
You know?
No, it's true. They're very serious about who is in and who is not.
Yes. No. And of course, like the surrealist, you know, became like a very dogmatical thing. And the founder, at the end, he was the only surrealist in the world, you know, as we all know. So I'm not really. I can't really deal with these categories, but I just know from my little production what I'm doing is that I really never feel like being the producer or the creator of things, you know. Much rather, I feel like I'm a sort of a rhizome. That's this network that mushrooms have in the ground. Yeah, of course, I'm determined by my genetics and where I was falling, where I was being thrown onto this planet. This is this personality that everybody has. But then, when things appear, it's really like a situation of this mushroom network. If the humidity, the rain is right, and the temperature is right, and somehow the symbiotic situation to a nearby tree, then suddenly things come out of the ground, and I'm astonished that they appear. You know, I never feel that I'm the great creator who intended for a long time, and then I finally managed to finish this great work of art. It's all kind of a coincidence, and rather than seeing a mountain and getting close to the mountain and then trying to climb the mountain somehow comes in my direction. And as it is there, I think, well, why don't I try to get in there? But it's never the case that I intend things on the long hand. If I tell you how I was able to make my first so-called big movie, it's all a coincidence. Or when I had my first exhibition at the Kunsthaus in Zurich, I mean, I still have no clue why they let me have an exhibition there. I told the guy when he asked me whether I want to exhibit, I have nothing to exhibit. And he said, well, you'll have some ideas, maybe. If not, then we don't have the exhibition.
That's kind of also how you entered the world of exhibitions, because somehow it happened. You didn't plan it. In '69, there was this amazing piece where you had 100,000 metal pieces, this pyramid, and they were put in bags. It was a durational performance. It's certainly more to do with Fluxus than with situationism, because as John Armleder explained beautifully yesterday in the interview at the Bayer Foundation, Fluxus wasn't a group with inclusion and exclusion mechanisms. Fluxus was more just a group of individualists who were all very different and happened to somehow be together. Whereas obviously with situationism, there were all these inclusion, exclusion mechanisms of kind of historic avant-garde movement. So it's, I think, the Fluxus thing, in an interesting way, even if it wasn't the reference to Fluxus, you were always an individualist. You were not part of a movement. How can you tell us a little bit about how you came into the art world? Because there was this happening. There were 100,000 metal pieces. There was Jean-Christophe Ammann. Then there were the visualized thinking processes. And all of a sudden, you started to do many things in the art world.
Well, the first thing that I ever did, of course, in a public square, and it was important that I did it on a public square, because after this, there was like no way back. It was a statement which was very important for me personally, not in the art world it was important, but for me personally, because I only later learned why I had to do this. Why did I have to put these 100 pieces of metal, they were little cubes of metal, onto a public square and sit there every day from 8 to 12 and from 1 to 6 and just counting them into bags of 1,000. And much later, I just had to do this. Much later, years later, I had kind of an explanation why I had to do this. It was like, to do this was empty, it was useless, it was stupid, everybody could do it. It was absolutely nothing. And I felt it was as much nothing as I am nothing. It was just there because I wanted it, right? There was no excuse, no explanation, it had nothing to do with art. It was just the naked will to do something which could not be justified. It was absolutely nothing. And this kind of the existential nothingness of doing this was obviously something I had to do, because I felt very similar like this piece.
And then the next sort of parallel reality, so to say, is the one we started, which is obviously music. And I thought it would be great to hear a little bit more about Yello. You started out by telling us wonderful stories. I wanted to ask you how it all began with Yello, because it was in 1979. I think you did a record for a label with a great name called Periphery Perfume in Zurich. And somehow it's this first record which brought you in touch, I think, with Boris Blank. Can you tell us about the beginning of Yello? And
well, the beginning, rather, of my approach to sound and music was that with my so-called experimental films, I was sitting in front of the screen and I was creating live sounds to my movies. Like I had a guitar with one string, I had objects that created sound that I found that very day that the film was presented at some underground festival. I was sitting at a table and I was just making a live soundtrack. And some producer, this wonderful man who had this wonderful label, Periphery Perfume, he heard this, he saw this, and he felt that I should go on stage with one of his punk bands, you know. And at that time, you would only rehearse on stage. You would never rehearse. You went on stage, and I remember I was kind of screaming and shouting in a non-existing language somewhere between English and Swahili, you know. It was, most of the performances were a total disaster, and some of them were kind of maybe a little musical or rhythmical, or in many cases the audience left when we performed, you know, because it was just a crazy live, very existential life statement. And then Periphery Perfume, this man, he created, based on such kind of a band, if you can call it a band, my first little single, which was called Cry for Fame, you know, which was totally self-ironical. We produced 100 pieces, but indirectly this was the beginning of Yello, because Boris heard that single and he felt this was a total disaster. It has nothing to do with music. He was a truck driver at that time, and he created all his wonderful tape loops, and he wanted to make pop songs. You know, I wanted just existential statements on stage. So he went to the man of Periphery Perfume and said, listen to my tapes. I'm much better than this crazy thing you are doing there. And Paul, the owner of that label, said, well, yeah, I like what you're doing, but I'm only doing a record with you if you work with Dieter. And Boris felt like this was the biggest disaster in his life, because he felt like somebody, like a painter who very carefully created his sound paintings. He was the opposite, still is the opposite of me. I have very much the approach of, even if I sing today in a studio or again live on stage with a band called Out of Chaos, it's very much the moment, and it's either there or not there. It's really like a Zen guy who goes into a pot of black ink and he makes his figures, and it's either there or not there. And for Boris, the disaster was a double disaster. First of all, I wasn't a good singer, and second, even a good singer he would not have liked, because he felt like somebody from the back would smear into his painting. You know, he felt like it was a masterpiece what he had done, and then now he had to put this voice. And maybe the first 20 years of Yello was really, personally, we always loved each other, but in the studio, we had always, or very often, the most incredible discussions, because Boris would have liked to work with a great singer, which I was never a great singer, and he would have worked with a singer that he could use like a computer, that he has total control. You know, even when he invites a guitar player to the studio, even before the guy starts, he tells him all the things that he's doing wrong, because he's a total control freak, because he always worked with sounds that he had total control over these sounds. And of course, these days, when he started, there was no sampling machines. Now you can do this, and then you can play piano with this sound. But when he started doing his loops, you had to do it in a very primitive way, but he had control over the way he did it. And to this very day, we're having discussions. We're just working on a new Yello album now, and now we made a little progress in our collaboration, that Boris is now commenting after my first attempt to sing and not before the first attempt.
That's nice of you. That's great. And so it really is 1 + 1 is 11. But I was kind of wondering, you know, when you started this very unlikely collaboration, what were the kind of influences? Were there any kind of bands, or was there any kind of music which inspired you, or was it really, did it grow out of your own kind of system?
Not really. I mean, Boris maybe was listening to some avant-garde pop music at the time, but of course there were some singers that I liked, but I mean, they were much too big examples.
Who would that be? Which singer?
Like I liked Eric Burdon, I liked Jim Morrison. You know, Jim Morrison on stage was really also living the approach of being to the degree of self-exploitation. I mean, he was burning on stage, you know, and I liked his approach. Of course, he had a wonderful voice and was a singer, which I never really was. There's a very funny anecdote. You know, our first sort of big success in the United States was a song called Bostage, yeah? And as I was never a great hitter of notes, this was all on one note. It went like, standing at the machine every day for all my life, I'm used to do it, and then it is the only thing I want is just to rush, push, cash, yeah? So Boris did not like this at all. Somehow it survived, and it made it, we created some 100 vinyl. It was called the maxi singles at the time. One ended up on the turntable of a black station, Frankie Crocker, WBLS. He loved it, and they thought we were two black avant-garde rappers from the West Coast, you know. And it was an immediate success, because at that time rap was just at the beginning, and I had just done it on one note because I wasn't really a great singer. And for me, I had a certain sense of rhythm. And this standing at the machinery, that was like the idea of sounding like a rhythm machine with my voice. And we then, based on that, got incredible contracts because this was a natural-born hit. And I remember the record company asked us to have one single concert in New York, which we had. It was in a legendary place called the Roxy. It was a only black dance place, and in the middle there was a boxing ring, and we appeared there in the middle of the night. We were announced in the dark, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Diane Brill, said the announcer, and I give you Yello. And we were on stage, and everybody, like Africa Bombata was opening up for us. It was a great scenery. And then these two cheeseheads on the stage, The audience was applauding as long as it was dark, and then the light went on, and they saw these two cheeseheads from Switzerland. It was total silence. Boris was very scared something would happen. It was an incredible scenery, even more so because when we came in there, we were through some back door, and there was a long table, and the people who went into this dance place, it was about 5,000 people in there, they confiscated their guns and knives, So on this table there were about 50 guns and 30 knives. When it was all silent after we had been announced, Boris was very scared. He thought, this is it. We're in the wrong place here. Anyhow, so the thing was a misunderstanding.
Now, when one interviews scientists, and we interviewed here in Basel, Albert Hofmann, he just was about to turn 100 years old. It was a great experience because when we went on stage, he said, you've got to tell the crowd that I'm 100 years old. And I said, but it's been in all the newspapers. He said, no, otherwise they think I'm 70 and I'm doing an appalling performance. So on stage with Albert Hofmann, and he started to actually say the moment he discovered LSD. And he remembered very much the day, he remembered almost the second. And I wanted to ask you about your most famous and most well-known single, Oh Yeah. If you remember the day and how this invention happened, how did Oh Yeah happen? How did it come about?
Well, this is probably one of the most minimalistic songs in the history of pop, and it has indeed quite a funny story, because normally when I listen to Boris's sound paintings, they are very inspiring for me. They are like the soundtrack, or the music rather, to a non-existing movie. I see immediately scenes and feelings and moods, and based on this inspiration, I'm sitting with my typewriter in the recording booth, a tape or now a computer runs, and I just listen to the tracks, and this is how I create my lyrics. Now with that song, it didn't inspire me. I had no idea what to do with it. And I asked Boris, so why don't you give me a little idea of the mood that you created with that song? And Boris said, imagine a king on a on an island in the South Sea, sort of near Tahiti, a king there. It's the evening, and the sun is sinking into the ocean. There is a light breeze. There is somebody coming with a drink, and you're just enjoying this situation. What would you say? And I said, oh yeah, and this very kind of even stupid way of unconditioned happiness, which is in this, oh yeah, this has been used in the Yankee Stadium when there is a great baseball action. It has been used in many, many movies. When in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, the hero sees his father's Ferrari that he wants to steal, comes, oh yeah, it's this kind of, and then all the lyrics are like, the lyrics are the moon, beautiful, the sun, even more beautiful. Oh yeah, that's the whole story of this thing.
Now another thing, and we have to accelerate because we've only got about 10 minutes left and so many questions, I have to speak faster. Now one of the things I wanted to ask you also is, of course, the videos, because we talked about your early films, and then with Yello, all of a sudden, you started to make music videos, and that's another kind of really important chapter and interesting in relation to also the brief history of new music, because we have there also a lot of connection of these new forms of music in relation to the moving image. And Czesław Miłosz, the poet, once said, we cannot understand music or poetry in the 20th, 21st century unless we somehow connect it to film. So, there is, for example, your famous video, Pinball Cha-Cha, which is, I think, part of your video performances at the White Box Center. And you said in an interview there you could almost see some moving sculptures. Can you tell us a little bit how you translated these frescoes then into music videos, which you did, of course, for Yello, but you did it also for other bands, for example, the famous Big in Japan video for Alphaville?
Yeah, I was very lucky because the two videos I did for other people, they were totally unknown when I did these videos, and it was like, you remember this wonderful song of the German band Trio, Da, 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 Du liebst mich nicht. So I was just lucky with these. But the Yello videos really, first of all, there were no videos, there were 60mm films. And the technique, so to speak, was that I used these moving frescoes, these very abstract films that I did with my wonderful 16mm camera superimposing single frames, and it was always a big adventure because you only knew about 30% how what would come out of this. But we used these as kind of stage designs, They were really our designs. We had them projected on Scotch screen, which gives a lot of light back, and we performed our little quite clownesque performances for Yello in front of these moving frescoes. And this made these videos different from other videos. And we were very lucky because this was just a time when MTV started, and they did not have enough material because it was a new format. So we were lucky that we already had these little films that were really films and no videos. They played them because they didn't have enough material to fill their program. If I did something today, I don't know what the state of MTV is, but I realized like 15 or 10 years later already, they would not play these crazy little pieces anymore because then they had enough material. But for Yello, it was very important because as we never played live really again after this one little disaster in New York, the videos were how our music got into the world, and because MTV did not have enough material, they played our videos, and this was basically the reason why we got popular as an unusual kind of pop band.
Are the composers in the brief history of new music, Xenakis or Stockhausen or Elliot Carter, when I asked them about the internet, they were not really online. It wasn't that kind of thing because it, arrived kind of very late in their work, the internet. So it didn't really touch them anymore. But I suppose, talking about MTV, obviously, that was the moment music was distributed through MTV, and then the internet arrived. I was very curious, when did you have your first computer, and how sort of the digital age entered in the work, and did the digital technology change the way you make music?
Oh, absolutely. As I said earlier, and we shouldn't forget that when Boris created his sounds, it was a quite archaic process with tape loops, And he used all kinds of things. I remember he was once, there were these big rubber balloons on which you could ride. This was like his bass. He would bang at this with a stick, and he was boo, that was his bass. And of course, later, the technique was the same, but the first really functional digital sampling machine, very expensive at the time, came from Australia, and it was called Fairlight. And for Boris, this was like a wonderful new world because everything got so easy, And indeed, he always felt like when he used certain sounds, it was like really inventing an instrument, because you had a three-dimensional image of that sound on the screen, and you could like sculpt your sound till you had what you wanted, And then you had a manual, and you could play piano with that sound, you know. So the digital world totally changed, but in a quantitative way, not in a qualitative way, changed his way of composing, because he had access to all the sounds in the world and could immediately form them into what he wanted. And his early method, I mean, Boris Blank, that's not me, is considered of the godfather of techno, because he used this technique before it was really ready in a very early way. But later then it became standard, and today every rapper and every musician is using that kind of technique.
What's the new album? Can you tell us what the two of you are working on? Because you said there's going to be a new Yello album coming soon, so I was very curious if you can tell us.
Well, that's always a very, very long process, because Boris has this approach that I also mentioned earlier. When he creates his sound tracks, it's always like music for film. He lives in his sound paintings, and he's totally unstructured. He has like maybe 50, 60 or 70 paintings that he works on at the same time. And he never knows which direction they go. And he needs that kind of approach, because like each brushstroke, in a very dialectical way, is influencing the next one. And he has absolutely no plan. And he lives in the studio. For him to create sounds is like breathing, really. You know, he's in the studio every day for 7-8 hours, and he is meandering around his many paintings that are all in a certain state. And when one painting is inspiring in a certain moment, then he takes it out of the computer and he works on it maybe for an hour, and then he puts it away and works on another one. So the process of him till he is ready to allow me in the studio to create the songs and the lyrics with this is a process that lasts 3-4 years, because he never finishes one piece and then does the next. He is always meandering between all these pieces. And now finally, after 4 years, I'm allowed in the studio. I can hear what he did, and it's always a big pleasure. And we are now, I'm with my abilities, singing and making lyrics and making the songs out of Boris's tracks.
I think we have to leave the room.
Really?
And we have a last question, because actually we cannot finish the interview without
One
very
last question.
Yeah, because there's a very urgent question. It's the only recurrent question in all my interviews, is about the unrealized project. And I know that you've got this novel, this epic novel, which you're working on, and it's a very long-term project where you rewrite, and I'm dying to hear more about your novel.
Well, it is really an approach that I described in the context with my big friend, I would say, Robert Walser. And as I'm doing, I feel like whatever I do is an intentional distraction from what I have a hate-love relationship, which is writing. But I cannot just sit down for an hour or 2 hours and do this. I have to do it out of an existential total boredom of like 2-3 weeks of absolute nothingness. And then I slowly get into this conversation with loneliness and with language, when I'm then in this altered state. And I have to artificially create such a situation. And sometimes I think I'm a farmer in Argentina. I have some farms far out where I'm totally alone, maybe with 2 gauchos. And there, every 2-3 years, this little text makes a little progress, and then it stops again. So most likely I'll never finish it, but I love to live in that mood when it's there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.